So welcome again. I'm Jeff Carter with Seattle City Club, and today, as part of our virtual Civic boot camp on COVID-19 and climate change, we're talking with Chris Rilling, Executive Director of Puget Soundkeeper, Heidi Roop, Lead Scientist for Science Communication with University of Washington's Climate Impacts Group, and Ryan Calkins, Port Commissioner with the Port of Seattle. So thank you all for joining us today. I'd like to start with Heidi to give us a overview, if you would, on climate change in general. What's going on globally, nationally, and Pacific Northwest?
Great, that's no small task.
I know.
Something my peers and colleagues summarize in condensed, short, 1,000-page syntheses every several years. But I'll just briefly summarize. I think a majority of people, even if we just look at national polling, are familiar with climate change and think that it's happening. Where there's a greater disconnect is understanding what the impacts of climate change mean for you in your place. And that is true for us in the Pacific Northwest as well. Just the quick high-level changes that we've experienced and that we expect to experience. So we know that global average temperatures have increased by about 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit since the late 1800s, early 1900s. When we look at Washington state specifically, that change has actually been on par with the global average change, again at 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit. So we've experienced around 1 degree Celsius change in global warming. So we are observing the planet warming as a consequence of emissions of greenhouse gases through our activities. Those are things that combust fossil fuels primarily. Our driving, our flying, industry, our built environment all contribute to the emissions that are creating this blanket that keeps our planet warm, this blanket of greenhouse gases. Why we care about adding more down to that Earth's duvet, right, is that translates into changing things that we rely on every day. For the Pacific Northwest, we really like to summarize it around water. Water is the great integrator of climate impacts in the Pacific Northwest. As we warm the atmosphere and we warm the region, we essentially are shifting our water balance. On the whole, we don't expect, say, the total amount of water we get in a year through precipitation, like snow or rain, to change, but it's when we experience that precipitation that is of great concern. So we are getting more water when we don't need it and less when we do. So what this means is warmer, wetter winters, but that warmth translates to less snowfall, right? Less snowpack, which is vital for our water systems, for our ecosystems, for supporting iconic species like salmon, and it connects our whole water cycle, right? So warmer, wetter winters and hotter, drier summers. So the flip side of that is we think about our rich agricultural economy and how we produce wonderful fruit and vegetable for a big part of the country and for export, right? So we have main industries, including some that are on this call, that are connected to the main resources and some large GDP generators for our state. So more water when we don't need it, less when we do. And importantly, we are already observing changes in those systems. So climate change isn't something that's far off in the future, something we need to consider is going to emerge or appear later on. We are seeing these changes already. We see on average 20-day earlier peak stream flow, meaning those warmer winters we're experiencing that. That's translating to changes in ecological systems as well as how we manage our water. We've experienced sea level rise in the city of Seattle. So at a tide gauge in Seattle, since 1900, sea level rise has risen about 9 inches. Sounds small, but it's already occurring. And most of that is actually due to the consequence of the water of the oceans warming. So as water warms, it expands. So those 9 inches, that's not necessarily the impact that we're going to experience from future sea level rise, which will be driven by loss of our large ice sheets in the Antarctic and in Greenland in the Arctic. So we have our coastal impacts and we have those impacts to our water systems, which again sort of translate. They trickle downstream from our peaks to our shores. And so there are obviously a myriad of interconnected impacts that we'll experience on plants and animals and our own built environment, stormwater, flooding. Our organization, the Climate Impacts Group, looks to characterize those impacts for our region and then really understand, well, what do those mean? what will they mean on the ground? How does that translate to impacts on our everyday life? And then also, what do we do? How do we prepare? How do we collaborate with folks like Ryan at the port to think about what science we have? How can that be used in a way that helps make informed decisions that ensure that we are building climate preparedness or climate resilience into the systems and into things as we go? So we will further along in this call talk about the pandemic and how that's really altered society in the short term. And we'll talk about, well, how does scientific information in the context of climate plug into this idea that we ultimately need to transform a myriad of systems that we rely on every day in order to address the global targets that are being set by the scientific and policy communities, which is to meet or not exceed 1.5 degrees C, which is 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit warming. And so just to remind you, I started at the top of this saying we are already 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit warmer. So we are 1.8 degrees towards that 2.7 degree target that we're trying to not breach or exceed by mid-century, by 2050. So that's sort of the larger global context into which these broader discussions about what do we do, how do we prepare, and how does this this massive reduction in emissions in the short term during the pandemic contribute to this overall challenge of preparing for climate change.
Wow, that was a great summary in a short time. I appreciate that,
Yes.
Heidi.
And you can find all of the resources and all of the data at the Climate Impacts Group's website, which is cig.uw.edu, but we can share resources as well.
Yeah. Well, speaking of Ryan, would you be able to talk about what the port, I know the port has a huge impact, both marine and the airport. So could you just briefly overview what work you're doing in terms of climate change?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And thanks, Jeff, for the invitation to come on and be a part of the panel. I think it's really gratifying for the port to be somebody or an organization that folks think of when they think about environmental impacts and climate change. And certainly we on the commission are pushing to make the port an even greater leader in climate adaptation efforts and climate mitigation efforts. Concretely, a few things that we're doing, I think when everybody thinks of the Port of Seattle, they probably think of the harbor. But we're also, we manage SeaTac Airport. That's our asset, and it's about 70% of our business, and it's a huge part of the impact from climate change that we in the region are responsible for. And so we are actively pursuing, we set a goal for ourselves by 2027, having 10% mix in all jet fuel at the airport to be sustainable aviation fuels, which is it's a term of art, but it refers to sustainably sourced, renewable, predominantly plant-based fuels. It is a big goal, and it's very technically challenging. And of course, we know that it's viable. It's just kind of expensive right now. And so we are working all the time to make sure that we have the legislative policies at the state level in place to manage this, federal level as well. That's probably the biggest thing that I and my colleague Fred, who were the Energy and Sustainability Committee at the port, that we're really focused on most of the time. On the waterfront, though, it's an industry that's driven by fossil fuels. The big ships that come in using bunker fuel, which is some of the dirtiest fuel that comes out of the ground, and then a lot of diesel equipment around the harbor. And we're a port, so we have some control when they get here. It's a little bit harder for us to do to control what they do in transit, but we do have levers to address that. And part of it is that we are going to electrify the waterfront as quickly as we can, and we're working in conjunction with the city of Seattle on a 30-year plan for an overall shorefront electrification. That's everything from making sure every boat can plug in, to making sure all the equipment on the waterfront is electrified, to ensuring that if there's the opportunity to actually produce sustainable, renewable electricity on the waterfront, that we would look into that as well. And I have a vision for the Port of Seattle being kind of the gateway for renewable energies in the ocean. The opportunities in sustainable renewables on our off our coast is really encouraging. We have a shipbuilder here in Seattle that is working on a prototype wave energy buoy that's currently off the shores of Hawaii right now, and we would love to be the point of fabrication and embarkation for those buoys to go out and provide clean, renewable energy without any impact to habitat and marine life. And so there's a lot of exciting things going on. We're also prototyping a sequestration project right in the Seattle harbor at the north end of Elliott Bay. We have a 1.5 acre pilot project in collaboration with the University of Washington, in which we are seeding eelgrass and kelp to try to pull as much carbon out of the air as we can, that then decomposes and settles on the ocean floor, doesn't go back up into the climate. And so it's quite impactful and can be significantly more impactful than land-based sequestration, because of the ability to keep basically putting more and more down on the ocean floor. So that's kind of a brief start of what we're doing. It is a major focus for us at the Port of Seattle, for sure.
Great, thank you. Chris, speaking of eelgrass and kelp and the marine environment, what do you do with Puget Soundkeeper to address climate change?
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks for inviting us, by the way. I'm really pleased to be here. And I'd like to thank Seattle City Club for the invitation. So my name is Chris Rilling. I'm the Executive Director of Puget Soundkeeper Alliance. Just as a brief background, I began my career commercial fishing in Prince William Sound, Alaska in 1983. And as you might imagine, I was there for 10 years. Yes, I was there when the Exxon Valdez ran aground in 1989. And I was captain of one of the first commercial boats to respond to that oil spill. One of my most vivid recollections of that disaster is that nothing was happening. We put our names on a list, and 4 days after the spill, they recruited us to go out and start protecting some of the hatcheries in the southern part of Prince William Sound. That oil spill caused the deaths of over 250,000 seabirds, 3,000 sea otters, 22 killer whales, and on and on. And I spent many, many months cleaning up animals, dead animals, picking up dead animals and cleaning up the spill. That was a really big milestone in my life that motivated me to stay involved in marine issues and marine pollution. And it's actually one of the big reasons I came to work for Puget Soundkeeper. So we're a waterkeeper organization. We were founded in 1984. Our mission is to preserve and protect the waters of Puget Sound. And we do that in many, many ways, mostly by recruiting volunteers to come out and monitor for pollution in Puget Sound. So we do kayak patrols, we do boat patrols. We're on the water every week, looking for sources of pollution, looking for marine debris, and we do cleanups with volunteers. We also do stewardship and education projects, so monitoring streams around the region with youth groups to educate them about the importance of clean water in general, but also for Puget Sound and the creatures that inhabit it, like our Chinook salmon and orcas. So our work on climate change is really focused on the impacts climate change and infrastructure are having on Puget Sound. And one of the big things that our organization focuses on is opposing the expansion of new or expanded fossil fuel infrastructure projects around Puget Sound. And we do that by challenging the environmental impact statements or through similar legal processes and legal appeals. And I can give you one really good example where we had a pretty big impact this last year, which was in the Anacortes Oil Refinery, also known as the Tesoro Refinery, which is a subsidiary of Marathon Petroleum Corporation. They had a proposal to begin producing up to 15,000 barrels per day of mixed xylenes. This is a petrochemical product that's used to make plastics. And the majority, if not all of that product, was to be shipped through Puget Sound overseas to Asian markets for the production of plastic. That would have been the equivalent of about 30 tankers a year passing through Puget Sound. And if you count round trips, that would have been 60 trips a year through Puget Sound. So we challenged that permit and the environmental impact statement that was done by Skagit County along with our partners. So we were working with Stand.Earth, Resources for Sustainable Communities, Friends of the San Juans, Friends of the Earth, and Evergreen Islands, and we were represented by Craig Law Firm. We challenged that particular permit on the grounds that they did not fully analyze the risks of additional vessel trips through Puget Sound and the increased risk of an oil and chemical spill, and of course the increased risks to threatened and critically endangered species like our southern resident killer whales among others. That project alone would have had the climate impact equivalent of adding about 75,000 vehicles to the road. The project would have required the refinery to transport significant quantities of feedstocks as well as shipping tankers of the refined product to Asia. So the Anacortes Refinery dropped their project in late December 31st, 2019. And so we're not going to see that expansion of that infrastructure project in Puget Sound. That was a really big win for us. You can read about all of the history of that project at www.pugetsoundkeeper.org. This was a multi-year appeal, multi-year process. Actually, in 2015, it wasn't settled until this last December. So that's kind of an example of the type of work we do. We're working on some other appeals as well. We will also, under the Clean Water Act, take legal action against some of these companies if they are discharging pollutants into our waterways. Sometimes there's a combined threat of both air pollution and water pollution. We typically focus on the Clean Water Act side of that. So in December, we issued a notice of intent to sue for stormwater pollution violations at the John Henry coal mine that's owned by the Pacific Coast Coal Company. They have not been operating since 1999, but they are considering reopening. At one point, I think they were producing 300,000 tons of coal a year. So that's another one that we're challenging on Clean Water Act grounds. We also do a lot of advocacy for strengthening our permitting and EIS processes. We involve our volunteers and we work with coalitions and community partners to build awareness. So we're approaching climate change in Puget Sound on multiple different, in multiple different ways, but the focus is really on the impacts and safety of transporting fuels and oils through Puget Sound, as well as the environmental impacts that might have.
Great, great, thank you, Chris. Your screen is a little freezing, but that's okay. We can hear you just fine. So in case you're seeing something on your end. So Heidi, we've heard a lot now about the pandemic and the global shutdown of everything, and how like dolphins are swimming into Venice and birds are happier and the air is cleaner. So what can you tell us about what's been happening climate-wise given the pandemic?
Yeah, so this is a difficult question to unpack, quite frankly, because we're thinking about what are the things we can immediately see, right, as cleaning up our waterways due to reduce pollution. It's amazing to see, right? We can see that Earth has, in some ways, these instantaneous ability to respond, right? When we clean up spaces, we have seen this in the past through legislation, when we think about acid rain and other examples. But when we think about emissions, there are lots of analyses happening right now by my peers and colleagues. I encourage folks to go to Carbon Brief, which is an excellent organization that is working to summarize and look at models of emissions and aggregating sort of the best scientific information we have right now to really understand the rapid change in emissions that we've experienced or we have perceived to experience. But I think there's an important lesson here, and I don't necessarily want to focus so much on how much we've reduced emissions, but really the context of the change and how we can think about this as an opportunity for rapid transformation to reach some of our global targets. So I concluded the first section by saying, you know, the global scientific and policy communities have really are striving to kind of set this limit in the Paris Climate Agreement of 1.5 degrees C warming, so 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit. To get there, there are all sorts of pathways we can take in terms of our emissions and reducing coal and fossil fuel use and myriads of combinations. So in a similar way that we run global climate models to project what the future might be as we add more greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, we also run models to look at what happens when we change the differing contributions of different fossil fuel uses and how the atmosphere absorbs, interacts with these emissions. And what we see is that we need around 7.5% annual reduction in our emissions to achieve these targets. There are much more sobering statistics when we look at the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change for these pathways to basically maintain this, to not exceed this 1.5 degrees C threshold. We're looking at massive reductions and different combinations of things like coal and gas and how much renewable we need to deploy globally. But what we do know is that in every single scenario laid forth by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change to meet those targets requires that we achieve net zero, meaning we have to balance what we continue to put in as we adapt systems to reduce our emissions. We actually have to sequester that carbon. So some of the things that Ryan's talking about, right? Like at scale, globally, we need to actually remove carbon from the atmosphere. So not only do we need to reduce what we're putting out, we basically need to flatten that to zero to achieve these targets. When we look at the pandemic, the International Energy Agency appears to have some of the best models looking at CO2 emissions and how much they've changed or what the projected change is over the year. And they're putting that around an 8% fall in CO2 this year, which is about what we need basically every year moving forward. So, you know, and again, the amount we emit does not translate to the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Those are two different things, right? So how much we emit, there are processes like the ocean takes up some of that, what we emit, but what the concentration of the global atmosphere changes, though that is actually right now, what we're understanding is going to be pretty small. So that isn't to serve to dismiss the impact, right? It's to say more that we still need to do more, right? And further, a global pandemic and shutting everything down, shutting the global economy down is not the solution to climate change, right? Putting people, our economies at risk, further impacting those who are already negatively impacted or disproportionately impacted by a lot of our social systems and economic systems and environmental inequities, right? This is not, I don't think anyone would advocate that this is the way that we move forward to address climate change, right? Instead, I think where we sit, and my colleagues on this call can perhaps provide you with the really concrete ways that they're thinking about how we actually embrace this opportunity to put people to work and to start adapting and mitigating our impact now. So we have completely changed how we understand how society works and is going to function in the near term and possibly even longer as the medical community understands the impact and how we get vaccines and deploy ways to protect people. But we have an opportunity now to think about, well, if we need to get people out working, what are shovel-ready projects that we can deploy that are helping us reach and exceed our ambitions for climate adaptation and preparation. Governor Inslee is working on this with the state legislature, thinking about how do we actually use this as an opportunity rather than okay, this is actually climate change. Either it's impossible to solve because the scale at which we need to make decisions is just too hard to comprehend if this was a minor blip, or, you know, just throw it all hell in a handbasket because, yeah, we're just not going to happen. I think really what we need to do is think about all the opportunity that's nested within this very scary time, right? That's very uncertain. You know, I'm sure many of you have seen these graphics go around with the flattening of the curve. And then behind the doctors looking at the flattening curve as the big curves of climate change. I think we can start to look in that rear view lens, or look forward, if you will, and stop looking in the rear view lens and look forward and say, what is the future we want, right? We now understand the impact of a global pandemic for which many countries were not prepared, right? So we can also look at how do we prepare society and shape the future that we want. And there's a lot there, I think, that we can embrace by thinking innovatively and collaborating more, right? You started this by saying, we're a program now that's moved online. How quickly did your organization adapt, right? There are bumps in the road. I'm sure, you know, donations and revenue, all of these things change, but it's requiring you to shift focus and think innovatively. And I really hope that in this, we start thinking about innovative collaborations and partnerships and ways that we can, as a colleague of mine likes to say, who's a disaster researcher, build back better. And we do that by taking into account many of the things that have, I think importantly, thinking about environmental justice and equity, but really understanding and putting climate change as part of our solutions for how we move forward. How do we build back better? I really hope that that building back better involves both adaptation and mitigation measures at a global scale.
Well, thank you. Ryan, Heidi was mentioning like, what have we learned? But I'd like to step back a little bit. And what has been the impact at the port level in terms of your climate change initiatives because of the pandemic?
Honestly, very little. We have decided that rather than let off the gas, that we're going to go full speed ahead with the big projects, in part because, you know, as Heidi mentioned, climate change will continue to be the single greatest concern, I think, for humanity. So a concrete example of that, we use a lot of natural gas at the airport. It's the fuel we use to heat the airport. It's also what we use in our shuttle buses that we run from the rental car facility and the employee parking lots. And when we first bought the shuttle buses, we had the exclusive contract for the renewable natural gas from Cedar Hills landfill in King County. And then California passed a low carbon fuel standard. Washington State does not have one. And so the price that King County could get for that natural gas in California was much better than what we could offer. So we lost that source and had to return to liquefied natural gas. We took a step a month ago to replace that LNG with RNG again. We went out to bid, and we've been working on this for 18 months. We went out to bid, and we were finally able to announce the Friday before Earth Day that we had secured a contract. And what we did was we took the contract that we needed for the buses, and we added the much larger portion of LNG that we use to heat the airport. And we said, let's make all of that an RNG contract. And as a result, we were able to, it's a large enough contract that we were able to secure it's a municipal solid waste source. It's actually across the country. It gets put into the pipeline for us there. And it is a huge reduction in greenhouse gas emissions for the Port of Seattle. In fact, we had a target of reducing by 50% our 2008 emissions by 2030. And we were able to do it this year because of that contract. So we beat our goal by 10 years. And now what we're working on is saying, all right, can we shift our 2050 goals? Can we accelerate those by a decade sooner? But it's not cheap. You know, it was a $23 million potential liability. However, we built into that an incentive to say that if we can get a low carbon fuel standard, some sort of carbon pricing on the books in Washington State, it means that that RNG for the Port of Seattle will become less costly because of the credits that become available for that kind of thing. So I think we're emblematic in that we're a large organization that's trying to do this on our own emissions. We're also looking at what we call Scope 2 and Scope 3 emissions, the emissions of our employees and our vendor partners, the truckers that come to the airport, creating all sorts of incentives to try to reduce those Scopes 2 and 3 emissions. But what is clear to me is that we need to do this as a system. And in our case, we are the only state or province on the West Coast without carbon pricing statewide, and we need it. And we need it both for the airport, we need it for the seaport, and we need it for our transportation sector, which right now is one of the largest contributors of greenhouse gas emissions. So we're going full speed ahead on this. As Heidi mentioned, we need an 8% reduction worldwide, which is about what we're getting, but not just this year. We need another 8% next year and the year after that. And it cannot come on the backs of the poor or developing countries. It needs to be led by our efforts. And so we think at the Port of Seattle, if we can demonstrate that a sustainable aviation fuel blend at a major commercial airport, the 8th largest in the United States, is possible, then that can be replicated by LAX and SFO and you name it, and hopefully around the country. So we think we can lead by example and show that it is economically viable to be able to put in place these climate actions.
Great, thanks, Ryan. Chris, what about you? What's been the impact of the pandemic on your programs at Puget Soundkeeper?
Well, as you might imagine, we've had to curtail a lot of our on-the-ground, volunteer-oriented work in terms of kayak patrols, beach cleanups, volunteer engagement, stream monitoring, that sort of thing. And we've had to move that into a virtual environment. And our staff have been really creative in finding ways to continue to engage our members and our volunteers through our online program. So one of the things we're doing currently is having virtual cleanups, virtual beach cleanups, where folks, of course, exercising appropriate social distancing. If they're out on the beach, happen to be doing a walk, they might pick up some garbage, and then they can take photos and upload that to our webpage. We have a hashtag PSK virtual cleanup that people can upload their photos to, and sort of share these experiences of continuing to do the good work of protecting Puget Sound even during this pandemic. So we're trying to make some of those virtual online adjustments to our volunteer activities, but really it has hampered us in terms of being able to get out and do on-the-ground monitoring, like I was describing earlier, of both our waterways and potential sources of pollution. But there are other ways that we can do that. So a lot of the data that we currently look at is internet-based. Entities that have to have a national pollution discharge elimination system permit and NPDES permit have to post their results of their testing online. That's something that we routinely monitor anyway, and we're continuing to do that. So it hasn't really hampered our ability to continue to look for sources of pollution and to hold polluters accountable. And one of the things that we are really concerned about, and that you might also have recognized, is that this pandemic really serves as sort of a cumulative impact on some of the communities that we're most concerned about. Environmental justice is really at the core of the work that we do at Puget Soundkeeper. As you all probably know, communities of color are disproportionately impacted by pollution. It turns out they're also disproportionately impacted by climate change. Those are the same communities where pollution is most prevalent that are also most at risk for climate change impacts, like sea level rise and other changes. And now that we have the coronavirus pandemic, that's added sort of a third layer, a trifecta, you could say, of threats that are impacting these disadvantaged communities. So that is something we're extremely concerned about. These communities were already facing challenges to begin with, and now having the pandemic layered on top of that is making things really bad. I don't know if you all have seen some of the recent King County data, but it shows the disproportionate impact by race of the coronavirus. So Hispanic, Latinos, Asian populations have much higher rates of infection and deaths due to coronavirus than, for instance, the white population. I don't know if you all have seen that, came out in the last couple of weeks. Mm-hmm. The other major thing that's happened, as you might have noticed in the news, is that the EPA has essentially taken a hiatus on enforcement of Clean Water and Clean Air Act laws. And unfortunately, our Washington Department of Ecology also issued a similar type of statement saying that they were going to be using their discretion in terms of enforcing our environmental laws. Well, when you think about the three things I just mentioned, climate change, pollution, and the coronavirus all impacting specific communities disproportionately, we really don't think this is the time that you should be backing off on enforcing our pollution laws. So we're concerned. Our op-ed that was written by our staff attorney, Caitlin Kinn, in the Seattle Times recently, describing this enforcement hiatus that EPA certainly has taken. Washington Department of Ecology has written us a letter saying, no, that's not their intent. They're still going to be enforcing our environmental laws. But nonetheless, they've said that they were going to use their discretion when it came to enforcing those laws. And we think that's sort of a misguided step, especially now when these communities are facing these additional threats of coronavirus and climate change. So we've written letters to both the Department of Ecology, to EPA, and most recently to our congressional delegation, to the governor, to the AG, to express some of these concerns to them with our partners. So we're working with Got Green, the Duwamish River Cleanup Coalition, and Front and Centered in terms of drafting and sending those letters to our state leaders. We're hoping to hear back from them to see what steps they plan to take to make sure that our laws are being enforced and that we're not putting these communities at greater risk than they already are experiencing. So, but if you look at the big picture of climate change, climate change has the potential to be an even greater threat to humanity than COVID-19, as difficult as that might be to imagine at this point. When you look at the cumulative impacts of climate change in the next 50 to 100 or even 200 years, it's really, really quite disturbing and alarming. So I think, if anything, this COVID crisis has taught us that if we can unify as a society, come together, as difficult as that is, and we're not there yet, we've seen the politicization of this coronavirus pandemic. But if we can come together, there are changes that we can make. We just have to work in unison to address the threat of climate change.
Well, thanks, Chris. That's a good lead into my next question for Heidi. You've touched on this already, but what are the lessons that we can learn from the global response to the pandemic that we can apply to address climate change, especially here in the Northwest?
Yeah, and I think Chris did a beautiful job there, summarizing this, and really, I think if we observe what's happened is that we have the capacity as society to make drastic changes, but we need to do that again in a way that's has fewer negative impacts on people, importantly, people who are already disproportionately impacted by climate change and environmental pollution and all of these other systems that we've talked about that make people more vulnerable to these impacts in the future. And I think we need to look at, we have capacity and we need to have agency, right? We had agency when we saw this threat that was immediate and near term, right? A threat that existed and persisted in our communities that had a very visual impact. Not only was it covered all over the media, it was hard to miss, right? The impact. We could see people dying. There were images of refrigerated trucks with bodies in them, right? Really powerful, terrifying imagery that gives you a visceral reaction. And it was in our own communities, right? And this is the challenge with climate change, is that it's often imperceptible, or it gets mashed up with other things. And so we are never really given the very clear picture that it's here and it's now, and it's harming people and it's harming the things we care about, right? And it's also a slow moving phenomenon. And I think that's the piece that is hard to grasp, and why there's a cognitive disconnect between, say, this pandemic that's here and now and this much greater impact, societal impact, that is climate change, right? It's happening slowly over time. Many of the things are imperceptible. Not necessarily if you're an individual experiencing those impacts now, and we have many communities that are, but we're maybe not labeling it as such, and we're not rallying around to say, we need to do something about this now, we need to protect ourselves, and we need to prepare. And so, the pandemic in one way is a small little example or sort of chrysalis of the power that could come from a social transformation that, when done with thought and through unifying and listening to new voices and redefining what knowledge is and what society can look like, we have an opportunity to really move forward on the climate dial, right? And I don't mean that just in terms of mitigation, right? In order to achieve these targets, we need social transformation. And that requires looking at these very hard truths that Chris just laid out, right? The people who are most negatively impacted are often the ones that don't have a voice. They're often the ones who are experiencing the impacts, but they have new ways and different ways and ways to actually think about how we can address climate change in communities, right? The issue with climate change is that while it's a global phenomenon, how we experience that is very local, and it goes all the way down to our decision makers. It goes down to the fact that, do we have people who are making smart, informed decisions now that take into account climate change, both what we're experiencing today and what we expect in the future, right? And we have the data, we have information that can help us make those decisions and that lay out a very stark future. But they also lay out, when we look at trajectories, right? I spend a lot of time in climate model land, and I think the one thing that is so important to understand about climate change, just as we have with the flattening of the curve during the pandemic, right? We got to choose as a society, right? We could shut things down to bend that curve, to lower that curve. It's exactly the same when we look at future climate change. In the Pacific Northwest, we get to choose based on how much we emit, whether we experience on the order of, say, 10 degrees Fahrenheit warming in the future or 5, right? And that choice, that's not arbitrary, right? That isn't, we actually choose. We choose through our behaviors. And by we all have a different amount that we can contribute to that, right? And a different responsibility to help make that decision about how we bend that curve, right? So people like Ryan are in positions where they're thinking critically about how do we actually do this at a scale? What we have different paths we can choose for our future, and in what way do we want to bend the curve, and how do we do that? And importantly, how do we do that in a way that makes society better and makes our communities better? And that is the opportunity. And I think, you know, we have a lot of new analogies that people can relate to. Most people couldn't understand sort of bending a curve before, and I think we've now all lived that. We've all lived having to make our own choice about how we flatten the curve. And it's the same thing moving forward. We have to put people in power who are going to make smart decisions about bending that curve, and we also need to develop our own individual agency to contribute to decisions that are happening at, say, a port, in our own communities, at the federal level, at the global level, right? Decisions about climate change happen everywhere. They're happening everywhere and every day. And we need to demand more of the people who are in a position of power now to reshape our future or build our economy back up to make sure we're doing that in a climate smart way.
Great, thanks, Heidi. So Ryan, as a person in position of power, how would you address that?
Ryan.
How would you address that same question? What have we learned from the pandemic, the global response, and how can we keep climate change, keep addressing climate change?
Well, I think the pandemic, if there were any silver lining to it, it's that it's killed a lot of sacred cows that needed to die. And you can think of examples in your own life and societal examples. I think for us at the Port of Seattle, we're seeing that the notion that every employee needs to be there in person every day, 9 to 5, is a sacred cow that we can forego now. That when we return, we're already conducting employee surveys to determine what is the optimal work from home come into the office balance for our employees. And you know, we have 2,000 employees, many of whom are customer service employees, frontline employees. Those folks obviously have done an amazing job as frontline folks in the response to the pandemic. But we also have a lot of engineers, professional scientists, lawyers, you know, useless policymakers like me that we can do a lot of work from home, and we probably should, not only because it requires less of an actual office footprint, and we know that buildings and houses require a lot of energy, but it also means that we're shortening commutes and lessening commutes, and those are huge steps when you take them in the aggregate. Another lesson that I would say that I've learned personally is, you know, there's often in policymaking this tension between kind of incremental approaches to progress versus big revolutionary change. And I think you can think of examples of progress being made in both ways. But a moment like this calls for big, bold action. And Heidi referenced the efforts being made at the state level to think about how do we do an employment initiative that is effectively a new deal, a green new deal, where we take this moment and we say, climate change is urgent. We've got a real employment crisis. Let's marry those two problems and come up with a solution that answers both. And I think at the Port of Seattle, we're already examining ways in which we can use our resources, our budget, to kickstart in this moment a stimulative effort for our region. We are an economic development agency, and so we are keenly interested in how do we make sure that we have shared prosperity throughout our region, that we provide good livelihoods for folks. And we know that the maritime environment will be a part of the climate change solution. It has been all along. The ocean has been our saving grace. And we know that moving forward, big solutions such as sequestration will happen principally around the water. And so we're in a great space to be able to do that. And you know, so I think this is not the time to move into austerity mode or to dial things back. It's actually the time to take big, big steps.
Thanks, Ryan. Chris, what would you say, this is such an overwhelming issue for all of us and a lot of people. What can people do, just the people listening today and just others who maybe aren't involved or in positions of power or whatever, what can they do to address climate change?
Well, there are obviously a lot of things we can do in terms of individual responsibilities and steps, but I often shy from saying that. I mean, I personally bike to work when I was biking to work, 34 miles round trip from Kirkland into Seattle and back every day. And when I was working for NOAA for the last 5 years in Seattle, it was the same thing. It was a shorter commute, but I bike nearly every day year round. So I do live that example. I encourage others to do it, but I know some people don't have that capability depending on where they live or their physical well-being, or they may have disability. They just may be challenged to do something like that. But part of the reason I'm hesitant to put a lot of that, the onus on individuals, is because I feel like we're confronting a larger problem, just like with plastic production, which incidentally comes from the fossil fuel industry, that we're being overwhelmed. We're being told we're part of the problem and we need to reduce our carbon footprint, when the fossil fuel industry is pumping oil and tar sands from shale in Canada out the roof. And we're literally just drowning in fossil fuels at the moment. And then they turn around to say to us, well, you all should, you should drive less or you should bike. So that to me is almost a red herring. What really needs to happen is we need to change the way we produce energy in this country. We need to shift from fossil fuels to green infrastructure and green energy. And that has to come from the political side and forcing this upon these fossil fuel industries, because they're not going to do it on their own. They will drill the last drop of oil, even if the entire planet is on fire. I've come to realize that, and it's a really disturbing thought, but I think that's the truth, unfortunately. So my feeling is, yes, individuals can do steps. I try to, I minimize my footprint, but is that really the solution? I don't think so. I think we really need to target the industries that are putting us in this hole, and those industries that aren't looking for the solutions that we all know are out there and that we all know we need, which is green energy, solar power, geothermal power, wind power. There are ways that we can get out from under this burden of the fossil fuel industry, but it has to come from the top, essentially. Yes, we can mobilize as individuals and communities, but I think it really takes leadership at the highest levels of our country. So that really brings me to my second major point, is vote. As Obama said, vote. Get the people into office who will actually support the things that I just said and can envision a future without fossil fuels, as opposed to a future where we're all going to be suffocating due to heat and drought or flooding. So what can people do? They can get involved in organizations like our organizations. I'm at PugetSoundkeeper.org. I didn't mean to be underdressed today. I did this intentionally. This is our cool t-shirt. Our Kyler Martz, he's a local tattoo artist, did this for us. You can become a member of PugetSoundkeeper.org and help us support our fight against expansion of fossil fuel infrastructure in Washington and Puget Sound in particular. If you sign up to become a member for Puget Soundkeeper, you'll get one of these cool t-shirts. But we'll also keep you informed about the work we're doing. As you know, and there's so many other organizations out there that are doing this great work too, to try and mobilize the public, to bring awareness about what's really happening with climate change and how we can mobilize to fight the fossil fuel industry and reverse the tide. The other thing you could do is just support candidates, right, that actually share the same views. So in addition to getting out there and voting, support those candidates like Governor Inslee, for instance, who are showing leadership and trying to get us going in the right direction. And then last but not least, I want to close it just on the personal aspect. Yes, let's maximize our ability to telework. So we've learned that through the pandemic. Let's keep doing that. Let's keep using mass transit, walking, biking, all the good things that came out of this disaster, really, we should incorporate in our future lifestyles. Thanks, Jeff.
Thanks, Chris. This might be a question. I want to jump to the audience participant questions. So Heidi, this might be one for you. Serena asked about training, internship, career opportunities, especially for immigrants relating to environmental science. She's wondering what advice you might have.
Yeah, that's a great question. And actually, Chris mentioned several of the organizations that I would suggest you could potentially volunteer for, or they have great information about the work that they're doing in this space. Got Green is one. Front and Centered, which is has hundreds of organizations, communities of color, that organizations of people of color who are working in the climate space, looking at it from a variety of angles, from agriculture to environmental pollution in their communities. Those are all wonderful organizations that I'm sure could use support and input, and could help you connect in the spaces that you're most interested in. I think that's an important piece of understanding where it is you want to contribute. We can all contribute, and obviously Puget Soundkeepers is a great organization that you could put some of your time and energy into. I think all these organizations need help more than ever. I think they're also really wonderful places that you could look in terms of organizations like not even organizations, some of our spaces like King County has a lot of work going on right now in terms of communicating about climate change to a variety of different communities, doing it in ways that connect with people who maybe don't have access to information, or want access to information and aren't currently getting it. So if you have that interest, I think there are all sorts of community organizations, as well as our county and jurisdictional spaces that could use eager and bright minds to contribute. And I guess, just as I see Serena's questions here about programs, so of course I'm biased. I'm at the University of Washington, so there are a variety of different majors. Climate change intersects with all of the spaces. So if you're interested in law or health or atmospheric sciences or art, there are, I'd say, almost every single program at UW has some sort of climate or environment angle. Evans schools, if you're interested more in policy, School of Marine and Environmental Affairs, they all have wonderful graduate programs that have applied experiences embedded within them. So I encourage you to check there, but I know Washington State University and others are also doing a lot of wonderful work in the climate space for graduate programs. So lots of options.
Great, thanks, Heidi. And a little plug, we have another virtual boot camp on May 29th that will talk about climate justice. So we have folks from City of Seattle, King County, DRCC, and Blue Green Alliance to talk about climate justice issues. Another question.
I'm sure they'll be able to tell you what kind of help they need or how to get involved. Those are all wonderful organizations.
Yes, I'm sure. We have another question, it looks like for Ryan, from Rachel. Carbon sequestration. Do you see the question, Ryan, or should I read it? I'll read it. Carbon sequestration is ultimately a short-term solution. Since it may take hundreds of years, the carbon we place in the ocean will return to the surface of the ocean and therefore be released back into the atmosphere down the line. Not to mention it takes a lot of energy and technology to place carbon in the deep ocean. Why has the Port of Seattle decided to pursue this option so much? Are there alternatives being considered to mitigate carbon emissions until emissions can be eliminated? Okay, that's a long question.
And I think I just disagree. It's actually not very energy intensive to grow a bunch of kelp out in our waterways. And the project has been a really good partnership with the University of Washington to determine the feasibility of it. It's been a very inexpensive project so far, but if it's successful, our intention is to make it a pilot project that can serve lots of estuaries around the Puget Sound. It is not the silver bullet that we need for sequestration to get this carbon out of the atmosphere, but it is a good start, and we need to all of us be pulling in the same direction to address climate change. The amount of carbon that we can pull out of the atmosphere in projects like this obviously isn't going to address our fossil fuel dependency. I wholeheartedly agree with the fact that we need to kick the habit. That's the first and most important thing. But we do need to actually start reducing as well. We need to be pulling some of this back out, as Heidi mentioned earlier. And I know that there's a lot of great efforts being done nationally and internationally to seek ways to find meaningful sequestration approaches, and we'll keep pursuing that as well. But first and foremost, we need to reduce emissions as quickly as possible, undoubtedly.
Thanks. Chris, it looks like we have time for maybe one more question. How do we push back against anti-science disinformation currently around COVID, but generally around climate change? What would you say to that?
Yeah, I saw that question. It's an excellent question, and it's one that I've struggled with to come up with an answer. In part because we're in an electronic world where everything is transmitted by the speed of light from one computer to the next. And so I think part of it is really just holding our social media companies accountable, like reporting when we see the video pandemic out there, which even though they've pulled it from Facebook and other social media sites, continues to crop up. Be vigilant and let your social media platform know, hey, this thing's out there again. So I think part of it could be our direct involvement in trying to hold social media platforms accountable and alert them to these types of things. But the other is just support valid news organizations. They've all been sort of maligned as fake media at this point. They really need our support. So do a subscription to the New York Times or Washington Post or Wall Street Journal, and steer some of the effort and money there. And hopefully that will, I don't know that it will, but marginalize some of those other conspiracy-oriented websites that are out there. But it's a really complex question that person raised. It's a great question, and I wish we all had an answer, because it is really at the root of the problem is that while you have good scientists out there trying to put out good information, there's so much room for these other, don't know what else to call them, but conspiracy theories or anti-science. They're literally trying to undermine scientists like Fauci, who are trying to do the right thing. And that's a really pernicious, difficult thing to confront and deal with.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. We only have like 2 minutes left. So do you have any like closing comments? Heidi, I see you raising your hand. Any closing thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think I just quickly want to address that question because I work in the space of climate change communication and have been connecting with some colleagues who study misinformation, disinformation, and again, it does rapidly propagate online. So I think, we do, as Chris said, I agree that we need to, hold these companies accountable. We also need to hold ourselves and our families and our friends accountable. We need to think critically about the information that we share. We need to steer away from the quick click, the quick reshare, the quick like. We help spread the misinformation. So I think that's important. And having those conversations with friends and families, it doesn't necessarily stop the spread of misinformation, but we all can play a role in making sure that we ourselves are not helping to spread the information to the wrong places. And I think, or spreading misinformation and actually sharing fact. And I think when we think about climate change, there are several, I could unpack this question. There's a lot of research into climate misinformation and climate change and all the debunking myths and all these things. There's several colleagues whose careers are based on this. And I think that the big thing that I would say is that we do know from polling in the United States that a majority of Americans believe that climate change is happening. But a minority hear about it regularly in the news, and even fewer talk about it on a regular basis. So it may sound small and trite, but I really honestly believe that if we talked about, say, at our dinner table about climate change and what it means for us, as much as we talk about the pandemic and how inconvenienced we are, or how concerned we are about our family and friends, or the loss that we're experiencing, I think we really need to start having conversations about climate change. Even in Washington State, which is, characteristically, stereotypically a very progressive place, a minority of adults in Washington State talk about climate change on a regular basis. And more often than not, we trust information from our families and friends. So if we're not talking about it and we're not hearing about it, how is it an issue, right? And so I think we often live in these echo chambers, and it's our responsibility to talk about why we care about this issue and how we move forward. So that's one way I think we combat that information. People are living and experiencing it, and we need to start bringing it to the fore and calling climate change what it is, right? Connecting the dots for people. I mean, people don't necessarily see it happening in our own backyards, even though it is. So let's talk about it and also not be the source of that misinformation.
Well, thank you, Heidi. I'm afraid we're come to the close, and I really appreciate you talking about, and Ryan and Chris talking about climate change today. Really informative conversation, informative discussion. Like I said, we have another Civic Bootcamp coming up May 29th on COVID-19 and climate justice. And I want to thank all the participants who joined in, and also thank our Civic Bootcamp supporting partner, Alaska Airlines, for helping us put these programs on. And thank you again. Have a great day. Stay safe out there. And I really appreciate all of your work. So thank you so much.